Labor has taken a slight hit and would need help from the Greens to form a government, according to the latest One News Colmar Brunton poll. Tonight's poll puts Labor on 47% and National on 33%. ACT continues to rise, now on 8%. New Zealand First continues to tumble down to 1%. Lara Greaves is a politics lecturer at Auckland University and she joins me now. Good evening, Lara. Kia ora. What are your first impressions? Kind of interesting.
Well, I think my first impression is we're kind of really, the big question mark over this election and what's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 weeks is, are Labor going to hold on enough to be able to govern alone? And like at the moment on current numbers, there's a potential that, say, if the election were held today, just with the kind of variation in sampling and polling, that they actually would have the numbers. So it's kind of hard to tell as to whether that will happen. But I think generally this is part of a downward trend for Labor, but a downward trend from like ridiculously high polling numbers a few months ago when they were back up at like, say, 62%.
Yeah, because if we look at the last 3 Colmars, that is the trend. So it was, down a few points from last time and the time before that, down 5 points. So the trend is downwards for them. National has had a bit of a bump here, but is it too little too late?
I think it is ultimately too little too late. I think Judith Collins has a lot to turn around in a short time period. I think she knew that on becoming leader that would be a challenge. I think that generally the downward trend from Labor is not necessarily anything to do with, say, their incompetency or National's competency. It's more a sort of function of the fact that New Zealand has been through this, collective trauma of COVID-19 and the associated crisis. And when we know from studies upon studies over the decades that whenever there's a crisis in a country, that people tend to cling to the incumbent government. So we're just really seeing Labor decline from those record high poll numbers.
Yeah, so is gratitude for that wearing off then?
I think potentially over time that's what happens, and it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily gratitude in that it's like just that kind of natural shock. When something happens in our environment, we tend to cling to what we know, and that's like well replicated in political psychology. So I think just that kind of initial shock of COVID is wearing off, and people are now getting adjusted to their new normal.
Let's look at the minors for a second, right? So New Zealand First, although it doesn't like to be called a minor party, the trend, if we look at the Colmar poll, they have actually been gaining. So in July, 2%, according to the Colmar. The one before this, 2.4. Now plunging down to 1. And if we look at ACT, it's going up, but National's gone up. So from that, can we conclude that New Zealand First is bleeding votes to ACT?
I think with any given poll, there's actually quite small numbers. The News Hub Read research poll attempted to look at numbers of voters crossing across, but when you worked it out, we're talking like a few people in a poll. And so it's not necessarily a reliable effect or something that we could rely on, but it does seem like New Zealand First voters are kind of, the old metaphor of rats on a sinking ship, that they're leaving because it actually is looking like their vote is going to be wasted. And I think New Zealand First voters and minor party voters generally are a little bit more strategic than major party voters. So they know, to go somewhere else, to put their vote somewhere else at this point. And we generally don't ever like to count Winston Peters out in politics, and we're normally quite reticent about saying, oh no, Winston Peters is out or New Zealand First is out. But I think at this point we probably have to say there's only a very, very slim chance of them coming back.
You're calling it, Lara, for New Zealand First?
Yeah, I'm pretty much calling it. I mean, you don't even really want to. Like, everyone is afraid to, but, they're down at 1%. Normally they don't do as well in the polls as they do on election day, but this is several percent that they have to try and come back from right before an election, and it's looking rather unlikely.
Because usually they get, about a 2% bump. So if they're on 1, they're still not going to make it. Greens, 7%. They tend to go down at the actual poll. So are they out of the danger zone, do you think, the Greens?
They're kind of heading there. Like at the moment, because everyone's kind of goes when they see a poll, they go, oh, a few of the Greens are safer at 5%. But yeah, totally. Like what you just said, we normally, for the Greens to be safe, they do need to be a couple of percentage points up. I guess we'll see, especially now, people are kind of settled into the campaign and settled in, and potentially some more votes will come off Labor over the next couple of weeks.
So is this I know on these numbers, Labor doesn't have enough to rule on its own, but is this sort of a first past the post election under an MMP banner?
In a way it is, but you know what we're going to see now? Firstly, with New Zealand First Out, we're going to have a four-party parliament, and that is going to be, other than being a bit dull for a lot of us that like to follow politics, that's going to create an incredibly strange dynamic where Labour, they've kind of got this flank party of the Greens on the left, and National is going to have a flanked party of ACT on the right. We're not going to have any of those centre parties that have that sort of coalition or blackmail potential, that what political scientists like to call it. So we're going to have this strange kind of two-party combo system, and so what that's going to do is it's going to put a lot of power in ACT or the Green Party, depending on, of course, who's governing after which election. And I think that sets up quite a sort of real tail wagging the dog situation for future elections, because we've seen that it's very, very difficult for any parties to come back from being outside of Parliament.
You think the loss of any minor parties is, well, it's bad for democracy generally, don't you? Is that your position?
I think it is when there's not so many parties to negotiate with. When they've only got ACT or the Green Party to negotiate with, I think that kind of tends to back the major parties into a corner. Now, some people would argue that's good because at the moment all the major parties do is tinker around the edges and everything's a bit dull. But on the other hand, that does create someone like David Seymour gives him a lot of power if it was, say, National, or the Greens, it gives them a little bit more power, and that can be quite freaky to a lot of voters, this idea that a minor party will, with 7-8% of the vote, will wield a disproportionate amount of power. So that's where we kind of hit that point where it's like, is it time to look at our 4% threshold at MMP?
So given that the trend in the Colmar poll, at least, is Labour going down and National just getting a few gains here and there, it's a time game, isn't it? So early votes, 30th of September for overseas, and then advance voting starts on October the 1st. Is it to Labour's advantage that a lot of people early vote?
I don't necessarily think. I think because so many people are early voting, 47% of voters did advance voting last election, and this time it's definitely going to be above 50% with a lot of people's worries around COVID. So I think we will see a good, at least half of the votes being advance voting. I think that when you hit that point of the electorate being an advance vote, that you kind of hit a point where it's no longer biased, that we can sit there on election night and go, oh, okay, we know we've got this kind of institutional knowledge the advance vote is going to go one way or the other. So I think on election night, while we will be watching some of those votes come in, I don't necessarily think that we can call it that Labour voters are necessarily going to go early or National voters.
Interesting, Lara, that this poll was after the leaders' debate, and I know that generally televised debates, don't swing voters, but hey, got a shift after some people call it for Judith Collins on the night.
Yeah, I think it's only a couple of percentage points. So again, it's not really clear whether it's. So I'm a bit suspicious of One News doing a poll a week after. It's almost like they're trying to ramp up the kind of competition or debate in a way and kind of make this into some kind of race when it really doesn't seem like much of a race. But it's also kind of hard because I think that generally Labour is trending downwards. So I think 1% in a week is not a huge deal. But the 2% for National is interesting, and it will be really interesting to see what happens in this next couple of weeks. But like I say, it's really hard to separate out the effects of Judith Collins having a fairly good debate performance from just that general downward trend from those record highs that Labour had months ago.
Great to talk to you. That is Lara Greaves, who is a political lecturer at Auckland University, speaking there on the latest political poll.